Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading Sign of the Beaver by Elizabeth George Speare. A little review, since we only read one chapter. Matt, who is only 13 years old, is alone in the wilderness. He and his father had traveled from Massachusetts up to Maine to build a cabin, clear land, and establish a home front. Then, after they got the log cabin built, Dad went back to Massachusetts to get Matt's mom, sister, and baby. Matt was left behind to guard the cabin and the corn, make sure everything was okay, and they still had it in possession. That's kind of the deal with this kind of living is you would go out, you would establish that you are living, and you have to live on the land for a certain amount of time, and you get the land for nothing. You don't have to buy it from anyone. Of course, the land did kind of belong to the Indians, but, they had treaties, so to speak. Anyway, so Matt is all by himself, and we are beginning chapter 2. His dad will be gone for 6 weeks and should be there in August. By the next morning, the tight place in his stomach was gone. By the morning after that, Matt decided that it was mighty pleasant living alone. He enjoyed waking to a day stretched before him to fill as he pleased. He could set himself the necessary chores without having to listen to any advice about how they should be done. How could he have thought that the time would move slowly? As the days passed and he cut one notch after another on his stick, Matt discovered there was never time enough for all that must be done between sunrise and sunset. Now remember, that's how he's keeping track of time, is by cutting notches in a stick. Although the cabin was finished, his father had left him the endless task of chinking the spaces between the logs with clay from the creek bed. At the edge of the clearing, there were trees to fell to let in more sun for the growing corn, and underbrush that kept creeping closer over the cleared ground. All this provided plenty of wood to be chopped and stacked in the wood pile against the cabin wall. To cook a meal for himself once or twice a day, he had to keep a fire going. Twice in the first few days, he'd waked and found the ashes cold. Back home in Quincy, Massachusetts, if his mother's fire burned out, she had sent him or Sarah with her shovel to borrow a live coal from a neighbor. What's the problem with that here? There are no neighbors. He had to gather twigs, make a wad of shredded cedar bark, then strike the flint and blow on the tiny spark until it burst into flame. A man could get mighty hungry before he had coaxed that spark into cooking fire. The corn patch needed constant tending. In these hot, bright days, every drop of water that these green shoots demanded had to be lugged from the creek, a kettleful at a time. And there was no way to water the corn without encouraging the weeds as well. As fast as he pulled one, new ones popped up. I know that feeling well. The crows drove him distracted, forever flapping about. A dozen times a day, he would dash at them fiercely, shouting and waving his arms. They would just fly lazily off and wait on a nearby treetop till his back was turned. He dared not waste his precious powder on them. That's for his gun. At night, wild creatures nibbled the tops of the green shoots. Once he sat up all night with his rifle across his knees, batting at the mosquitoes. When morning came, he stumbled into the cabin and slept away half the day. That was the second time the fire went out. He seemed to be hungrier than ever before in his life. The barrel of flour was going down almost as fast as when two were dipping into it. He depended on his gun to keep his stomach filled. He was still proud of that gun, but no longer in awe of it. Carrying it over his shoulder, he set out confidently into the forest, venturing farther each day, certain of bringing home a duck or a rabbit for his dinner. For a change of diet, he could take his fish pole and follow the twisting course of the creek, or walk the trail his father had blazed to a pond some distance away. In no time, he could catch all the fish he could eat. Twice he had glimpsed a deer moving through the trees just out of range of his rifle. One of these days, he promised himself he would bring one down. It was a good life, with only a few small annoyances buzzing like mosquitoes inside his head. One of these was the thought of Indians. Not that he feared them. His father had been assured by the proprietors that his new settlement would be safe. Since the last treaty with the tribes, there had not been an attack reported anywhere in this part of Maine. Still, one could not entirely forget all those horrid tales, and he just didn't like the feeling he had sometimes that someone was watching him. He couldn't prove it. He could never see anything more than a quick shadow that might be a moving branch, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was there. One of these pieces of advice his father had been so fond of giving him had been about Indians. "They won't bother you," he said. "Most of them have left for Canada. The ones who stayed don't want to make any trouble. But Indians take great stock in politeness. Should you meet one, speak to him just the same as the minister back home." Matt had seen his father follow his own advice. Once, when they had tramped a long way from the cabin, they had seen in the distance a solitary, dark-skinned figure. The two men had nodded to each other gravely and lifted a hand in salute, exactly as if they had been two deacons passing in the town square. But how could you be respectful to a shadow that would not show itself? It made Matt uneasy. He had grown used to the stillness. In fact, he knew now that the forest is rarely quiet. As he tramped through it, he was accompanied by the chirruping of birds, the chatter of squirrels, and the whine and twang of thousands of bothersome insects. In the night, he could recognize now the strange sounds that used to startle him. The grunt of a porcupine rummaging in the garden, the boom of a great horned owl, the scream of some small creature pounced upon in the forest, or the long, quavering cry of the loon from the distant pond. The first time he'd heard that loon call, he had thought it was a wolf. Now he liked to hear it. Mournful as it was the cry of another living creature. Matt would worm his shoulder into a comfortable spot in his hemlock boughs that made his mattress, pull the blanket over his head to shut out the mosquitoes, and fall asleep, well satisfied with the world. He would have liked, however, to have someone to talk to occasionally. He hadn't reckoned on missing that. For much of the day, he was content to be alone, tramping through the woods or sitting on the bank of the creek, dangling his fish line. He was like his father in that. But there were times when he thought he'd like to share with someone, with anybody, even his sister Sarah, though he'd never paid much mind to her at home. So he was not so quick-witted as he should have been when, unexpectedly, someone arrived. So who do you think it is? Do you think it's that mysterious shadow? Do you think it's somebody that's Native American? Or do you think it's maybe a trapper on his way to Canada? Well, we'll find out. Chapter 3. He was sitting on the flat stone that served as a doorstep, waiting for his supper to cook. The late sun slanted in long yellow bars across the clearing. The forest beyond was already in shadow. Matt was feeling well pleased with his day. That morning he had shot a rabbit. He had skinned it carefully, stretching the fur against the cabin wall to dry. Chunks of the meat were boiling now in the kettle over the fire, and the good smell came through the door and made his mouth water. In the dimness of the trees, a darker shadow moved. This time it didn't disappear, but came steadily nearer. He could hear the crackle of twigs under his heavy boots. Matt leaped to his feet. "Pa!" No answer. It wasn't his father, of course. It couldn't be. An Indian? Matt felt a curl of alarm against his backbone. He stood waiting, his muscles tensed. The man who came tramping out from the trees was not an Indian. He was heavy-set, the fat bulging under a ragged blue army coat. His face was almost invisible behind a tangle of reddish whiskers. Halfway across the clearing, he stopped. "Howdy," he called cheerily. "Hello," Matt answered uncertainly. Was this someone who ought to be greeted like a deacon? The stranger came closer so that Matt could see the small blue eyes that glittered in the weather-hardened face. The man stood, deliberately taking his time, looking over the cabin and the cornfield. "Nice place you've got here." Matt said nothing. The man peered curiously over Matt's shoulder through the open door. He could easily see the cabin was empty. "You all alone here?" Matt hesitated. "My father is away just now." "Be back soon, will he?" Matt was puzzled by his own unwillingness to answer. He ought to be glad to see anyone after all these days alone, but somehow he wasn't. He didn't quite know why he found himself lying. "Any time now," he said. "He went back to the river to get supplies. He might be back tonight. When I saw you coming, I thought it was him." "Guess I surprised you. Reckon you didn't get much company way off here." "No, we don't," Matt answered. "Then your pappy wouldn't want you to turn away a visitor, would he?" the man asked. "Thought maybe you'd ask me to stay for supper. I got a whiff of it a half a mile away." Matt remembered his manners. The man's easy grin was beginning to wipe away some of his doubts. "Of course," he said. "Come in, sir." The man snorted. "Ben's the name," he said. "You may have heard of me in the river town." "We didn't stay in that town very long," Matt answered. He hurried now to light a candle. The stranger stood inside the door, taking in every inch of the small room. "Your pappy knows how to build a good, tight house," he said. "You reckon on staying here for good?" "It's our land," Matt told him. In the candlelight, the room looked snug and homey, something to be proud of, showing off to a stranger. "My mother and sister will be coming soon." "More folks coming all the time," the man said. "Time was you could tramp for a month and never see a chimney. Now the towns is spreading out from the river every which way." His eye fell on the rifle hanging over the door. He let out a slow, admiring whistle and walked over to run his hand along the stock. "Mighty fine piece," he said. "Worth a passel of beaver." "Oh, my father wouldn't sell it," Matt said shortly. He was busying himself now to make a stranger welcome. He scooped out a good measure of flour, stirred in some water, patted the dough out on a clean ash board, propped it up in front of the fire to bake. He laid out the 2 bowls on the table and 2 pewter spoons. He poured molasses into the 1 pewter dish. Then he ladled the hot stew into the bowls. The way the stew disappeared, the stranger couldn't have eaten a meal for a good while. Matt took a very small share for himself. He pulled back his hand and watched the man snatch the last of the corn cakes, sopping up the last of the molasses with it. Finally, Ben pushed back his stool and drew the back of his hand across his beard. "That was mighty tasty, son, mighty tasty. You wouldn't have a mite of tobacco now, would you?" "I'm sorry," Matt said. "My father doesn't have any." "Pity. Can't be helped, I suppose." In the easy silence that followed, Matt decided to ask a question of his own. "Are you traveling to the river?" Ben snorted again. "Not likely. I'm keeping as far off from the river as I can till things quiet down." Matt waited. "Tell the truth, I got away from that town just in time. Wasn't nothing they could prove, but they sure had it in for me. So I says, 'Ben,' I says, 'you been planning on getting yourself some beaver pelts. Looks like now's the time to get moving. I aim to settle in with the Redskins a bit, maybe move on north.'" "You mean you're going to live with the Indians?" "Could do worse. I can bed down about anywhere." It certainly looked as though, invited or not, Ben was planning on bedding down right here in the cabin. He had eased himself off the stool and sprawled out on the floor, his shoulders propped against the wall. He pulled a dirty corncob pipe from his pocket and stared down at it ruthfully. "Pity," he said again. "Meal like that needs backache to settle it right." He put the pipe away and shifted his heavy bulk against the wall. "When I was not more'n your age," he drawled, well-fed and ready to talk, "I'd spend the whole winter with the Redskins, hunt with 'em, trap. Easy to pick up their lingo, still remember a deal of it. But this country ain't the same anymore. You gotta go west. Ohio, maybe, to get any decent trapping. The Indians still hunt there, don't they? Matt asked. The Indians has mostly cleared out of these parts, Ben told him. What wasn't killed off in the war got took with the sickness. A deal of 'em moved on to Canada. What's left makes a mighty poor living, game getting so scarce. Where do they live? Oh, roundabout. Ben waved vaguely toward the forest. They make small camps for a while and then move on. The Penobscots stick like burrs, won't give up. They still hunt and trap. No way to stop them. Never got it through their heads they don't still own this land. You never seen none of them? My father did once. Do they speak English? Enough to get what they want. They pick it up from the traders. What pelts they can scrape together they take into town. They can strike a sharp deal. You got to know how to handle them. Reason you ain't seen 'em, he went on, they got enough sense to clear out of these parts when the bugs is bad. They move off, the whole lot, down to the coast to get their year's mess of clams. Should be moving back about now. They stay the summer and then go off for the big hunt come fall. Them hunts, he remembered, ain't nothing like 'em nowadays. Bows and arrows was all they had. Still use 'em some if they can't lay hands on a gun. I got so's I was damn near as good as any of 'em. Don't suppose I could hit a barn door now. Ben's voice drawled on and on. Thickened with food and drowsiness, he told of the big moose hunts of his day with the Indians. He'd fought in the recent war against the French, and he despised them for stirring up the Indians against the Maine settlements. He seemed to have single-handedly shot down half the French army. Especially, he hated the Jesuit priests who had egged the Redskins on. He had once been part of an expedition that broke into a chapel and smashed the popish idols. Once he'd been taken captive by the fierce Iroquois, who were set on putting him on torture, but he had been too smart for them and escaped in the night. Listening, Matt couldn't make this man out. To hear him talk, he'd been as big a hero as Jack the Giant Killer. But he didn't look the part. He had certainly fallen on hard times lately. No doubt about it, however, he could tell a good story. The man's voice was trailing off, and he slumped lower and lower. Presently, he was sprawled flat on the floor and snoring. It was clear enough that he could bed down anywhere. At least he hadn't taken over Matt's bed. Matt moved about quietly, though he doubted anything could disturb his guest. He cleaned off the bowls with a twig brush. Then he banked the fire with ashes. Finally, he settled down on his hemlock mattress, but he couldn't sleep. He lay staring up on the log roof, even after the last flickers of firelight had died away and the cabin was in darkness. He couldn't quiet his uneasy thoughts. Bragging about his adventures by the fire, Ben had seemed harmless, just a fat, tired old man grateful for a good meal. To be honest, Matt had enjoyed his company. Now he began to worry. How long was Ben going to stay? He was sure to find out soon that Matt was living alone. When he did, would he decide it was more comfortable here than in an Indian village? At the rate he'd wolfed down that supper, the flour and molasses wouldn't hold out long. Would he expect Matt to go on providing meals and waiting on him? And why had he left that town on the river in such a hurry? That's my question, too. Was there really some charge against him? Was he dangerous? Perhaps a murderer? At that thought, Matt sat up in his pine bed. He'd be sensible to stay awake and on guard. He'd half a mind to fetch down his father's rifle and keep it near at hand. Then he felt ashamed. What would his father say about begrudging a stranger a meal and a night's rest? All the same, he was determined not to shut his eyes that night. He kept them open for a long time, but suddenly he jerked out of deep sleep and saw the daylight was streaming across the cabin floor. The cabin door was open, and the man was gone. Perhaps he'd only stepped outside. Matt stumbled to the door. No sign of the stranger. Relief flooded over him. All that worrying, and the man had never intended to stay. Perhaps he'd actually believed that lie that his father was returning in the day. Then once again, Matt felt ashamed. He must have made it all too plain that Ben wasn't welcome. Would Pa say he had done wrong? Still, it was too early to be sure. At any moment, Ben might appear hungry for breakfast. He'd better stir up some fresh corn cakes. And then he noticed. What do you think he noticed? His father's rifle was not hanging over the door. In a panic, he searched the cabin, in his bed, the corner shelves, under the table and the stools. He rushed back to the door and onto the edge of the forest. It was no use. No way of telling which way the man had taken or how long he'd been on his way while Matt slept. Ben was gone, and so was the rifle. He should have kept it in his hands, as his hunch had warned him. He could see now that the man had had his mind set on that gun from the moment he laid eyes on it. But even if Matt had had it in his hands, could he have held out against those burly arms? And to keep his gun, could he actually have shot a man, even a criminal? It was only later, when his rage began to die down, that he felt a prickle of fear. Now he had no protection and no way to get meat. Sick with anger, he sat staring at his row of notched sticks. It would be a month at least before his father returned. A month of nothing but fish. And what would his father say? I kind of suspected that that's what Ben was going to do. The way he said, wow, this is a nice rifle. That's a shame. Okay. Well, we'll find out what Matt does if he fishes and fishes and fishes, or if maybe his dad comes back in the next chapter. Okay, bye-bye.